What do you do if you have an administration that seems to not respect the law very much?
We've never been here as a country before that does not respect the separation of power that was created as a checks and balance so that we don't have this kind of autocracy or dictatorship or somebody who can just single-handedly make all the decisions. That's why we have the three branches of government.
The cases in my book don't make me super optimistic that the court is really going to save us here because, in each one of those cases, there's pretrial detention for dangerousness, there's coercive plea bargaining, overcrowded prisons where you're jamming two people in a tiny little space that's barely big enough for one. You have a living space the size of a door, and the court knows that that's inhumane and cruel and unusual, but, they accept it. And in each of these cases, stop and frisk without probable cause, even though the Supreme Court knows the Constitution requires probable cause. There's all these cases where basically the court just gives in to what the government's asking for.
What do you feel that this current Supreme Court is going to be able or willing to do of stopping or stoppages on a president who does not obey the law?
The issue with this current administration, and this is where things get a little scary, is they often want to push the envelope of what they can do. They want to try to change settled understandings of what is and isn't legal. And most frightening of all is
I will stand for you. Could you stand for me? Everybody deserves to be free.
Welcome, Professor Rachel Elise Barkow, Professor of Law and Faculty, Director of the Zimroth Center on the Administration of Criminal Law at NYU School of Law. She's a past member of the United States Sentencing Commission, one of the country's leading experts on criminal law and policy, the author of Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration, and also what we just got, our copy of her new book, Justice Abandoned: How the Supreme Court Ignored the Constitution and Enabled Mass Incarceration. Welcome to the FreeHer Podcast, Professor.
Oh, thank you so much.
So you and I have gone back probably close to a decade now in terms of running into each other in the very lofty hallways of Congress and hearings and just advocacy. And we have followed your work and relied upon you for all of the information about the legality, the constitutionality, what we should be raising awareness of as we talk about these issues and how they affect us as incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. And so it was just, you were at the top of our list in terms of who can we get to talk about this issue. Somebody that we trust will bring us factual information, who also has the level of expertise that you bring. So without further ado, let's jump right into this. We have been following the new administration's many things because so many of the proposed policies and the things that are happening that are coming out through executive orders and so forth of the Trump administration are directly affect us as formerly incarcerated people in a way that is even more egregious than just the normal person. It is frightening for us. We are nervous about what will come, not only to mention that we are a nonprofit organization in line with several nonprofits who are working on these issues. And the issues just to increase justice and to make sure that due process is followed. And so when we heard about Trump's idea to incarcerate U.S. citizens abroad, for us, it raised serious constitutional concerns. And what is happening with that? Is this a real thing? Is this something that what should we be doing about this? Can you tell us from your perspective and your expertise what this means?
Yeah, so so it's not a real thing right now. He has not done that, but I think everyone should take seriously the things that the president says, because even though he often says things that sound, outrageous, they are then often followed up as reality, or he tries to make them reality. So, I think it's something to take seriously, because he's now said on more than one occasion he's interested in this idea of maybe we'll send some U.S. citizens to El Salvador and, the really horrible prison that they have there. And, I should just say that no one should be sent to that facility. That facility, violates all kinds of international norms on the bare minimum of treatment for any human being. And so, the idea that we would send anyone there is outrageous. But he is floating the idea of sending U.S. citizens, and his press secretary tried to dial back a little bit on that. She said, well, he would only do it if it's legal. And, so if he was going to follow what the current understanding of the law is, he absolutely could not do that. He could not send you can't deport an American citizen. You can't, as punishment, take away someone's citizenship.
Can you help us, Rachel? Just for a moment, let's just dig down on that a little bit, because one of the reasons why we created the FreeHer Podcast was to help to increase awareness and understanding about how these policies, laws affect us, what are our constitutional rights as incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. So that is one of the fears that we're hearing from our folks. Is it possible to take somebody who is a United States citizen, because we become incarcerated, or formerly incarcerated for that matter, is it possible to renounce our citizenship, and to relegate us to a foreign prison?
Not under current law. So there's a Supreme Court case, Trope versus Dulles, where the Supreme Court said that you cannot remove someone's citizenship as a form of punishment. So, assuming that case stays as good law, there's no reason to believe that the Supreme Court would overrule it or backpedal on it. That is the law, is that you can't take away somebody's citizenship as a form of punishment. Now, the issue with this current administration, and this is where things get a little scary, is they often want to push the envelope of what they can do, or they want to try to change settled understandings of what is and isn't legal. And most frightening of all is that kind of flirting with, or maybe even actually disobeying Supreme Court decisions or not complying with Supreme Court orders. So in the current climate right now, we know there is a man from Maryland who the administration has said should never have been sent to El Salvador. It was a mistake, because there was an order in his case that said he could not be removed to El Salvador. That was a valid judicial order in his case, and the administration, removed him anyway, and sent him to El Salvador. So he has filed legal proceedings. They made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court of the United States issued a decision that was signed by all 9 justices that said the administration needs to facilitate his return to the United States so that he can get his due process rights, so he can get a hearing, so it can be decided whether or not he can be removed. The administration has disobeyed what the Supreme Court said. They have not facilitated his return to the United States. There's a hearing before a judge right now in Maryland, and she is beside herself because she has said, you've done nothing. You, the administration, have done nothing, and the Supreme Court ordered you to facilitate. So I think the scary part is this administration certainly seems to be testing how much it can get away with in terms of disobeying things the Supreme Court says. So although I can tell you there's this Supreme Court case, Trope versus Dulles, that says you can't take away someone's citizenship, the fear is this administration just saying, so what? So what if there's a Supreme Court case? What are you going to do about it if we actually decide to do it? Now, I think we're a long way from that. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think that it's important for people to be alert to the fact that the administration right now is testing the waters of seeing how far it can go with disobeying things the Supreme Court tells it.
And this is horrific for all of the people who have been sent to the prison in El Salvador without due process, for everybody, for every human being who's here in this country, who has met the fate of some sort of punishment without due process, is just unbelievable. However, if this were to happen, we have Trump has often used terminology such as just for violent people or just for those people. And we certainly have spent more than a decade at the National Council working with lots of other folks, including yourself, around not carving out people, and that justice should be applied with equally to everybody. But if we're really afraid of this, because if the administration were to place people who are currently in the federal system, for instance, which is the system that I was incarcerated in, and we lived every day just in fear that you would fall through the cracks. That's just a regular experience of being incarcerated. You're just afraid you're going to get lost in a system somewhere. And there's a reality that is not that hard to do. And once somebody is sent there, we're seeing they're not fixing the problem. The administration is pretending now that they have no power once somebody is sent there to return them. What is that? And how can the Supreme Court step in to make sure that this does not happen?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So
Yeah.
I'll start with the first part of your question, which is so you're right. The administration tried to claim, if we did this for American citizens, and again, it would be illegal it would be illegal for any American citizen to lose their citizenship as a form of punishment, full stop. But the administration, when they've talked about this or floated the idea, they have said, well, we would only do it, for the worst of the worst, the most violent. You pointed out that's problematic for a whole host of reasons. And I'll just add that anytime the government has ever said it was only going to carve out some kind of punishment for the worst of the worst, that never happens. It always expands to cover just about anybody anyway. One of the things I actually talk about in the book that I've been thinking about a lot lately is when the Supreme Court decided the case of Salerno, which was the first time that the Supreme Court recognized that you could detain somebody who was presumed innocent before they had been found guilty, based on this idea that they're somehow dangerous just because they'd been arrested for a crime. That was for 200 years. The idea was, of course, you could not do that. That would violate due process and our Constitution. But, the Supreme Court said it was okay. And when they did that, the government had argued before the Supreme Court, we're only going to detain the most violent people, the most dangerous people. Those are the people we're going to detain. Maybe it'd be 10% of the federal prison population, because the law the court was considering was the federal bail law. Well, I'm here to tell you the reality today in America, 75% of all federal defendants are detained pretrial. It is not the most dangerous, the most extreme. That is just, so that is a false promise. Whenever anyone hears that, I just encourage you to look at history, because it is just not true that we are, as a country, have ever been very good at just reserving things for the worst of the worst and the most violent, the most depraved. That's not how any of this operates. It always expands, and it always expands to include, frankly, just about anybody that's in the general orbit of criminal justice in America. So I think that is one thing to worry about that. And then your second point, which is, what happens if after someone is sent to this facility, how do we keep track of them? How do we know anything about them? And you're really right to raise that red flag, because currently, there's one person at least that we know of that has been completely lost track of. Yeah, this man, he was employed as a hairdresser. People have no idea where he is. It looks like he's disappeared off the face of the earth. So, and that's why you can't hand over, your own citizens to another sovereign and just say, well, that's their problem now. That is certainly incompatible with our constitutional order and how we think about things. The worry, though, is right now what the Supreme Court has said so far is, once someone, though, is outside, once the mistake has been made. So, in the case of Mr. Abrego, who's the man from Maryland, he should never have been sent over there. The Supreme Court said, look, we're not saying you have to, we're telling the executive how to do its job. We're just saying you have to facilitate his return. And so that's a little wishy-washy, because what that means is first of all, they're not facilitating, but let's say they even said, well, we tried, they said no, so, there's nothing more we can do. That would be the same response if it was an American citizen. Like there's nothing about anything that's happened so far to Mr. Abrego that's really, other than the fact that, he himself is someone who is an immigrant. The fact that the administration is saying once someone is over there, we can't bring them back, that would apply to citizens and non-citizens alike had they been sent there. So because they're claiming, the administration's claim is not, we can't bring Mr. Abrego back because he's a citizen of El Salvador. Their claim is we can't bring him back because he's in the custody of El Salvador, which is what happened when all those people on the plane were turned over to El Salvador. And so if an American citizen had been on that plane, the administration's argument is exactly the same. And that is actually one of the things that Justice Sotomayor pointed out in her dissent. She said, we should take a harder line on this because everything the administration is saying could apply to U.S. citizens as well. So, I think it's a very scary time. I wish I could be more reassuring. I can be reassuring in the sense that the law is clear that you can't remove someone's citizenship as punishment. But what is less clear is, what do you do if you have an administration that seems to not respect the law very much, that wants to push boundaries?
We've never been here as a country before that does not respect the separation of power that was created as a checks and balance, so that we don't have this, kind of autocracy or dictatorship or somebody who can just single-handedly make all the decisions. That's why we have the three branches of government, and the courts are there to determine the constitutionality of decisions that are made by the legislature or also the president of the United States. And so without that, it's really our only guardrail against something like this happening. And you've done a lot of work, as demonstrated just in your last publication, about of Justice Abandon, by pulling these cases, these 6 cases that bring us along to understanding how we became the most incarcerating country in the world. What do you feel that this current Supreme Court is going to be able or willing to do to put any sort of stopping or stoppages on a president who does not obey the law?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I guess I'll start by saying, one of the reasons we're in this mess is there is another branch that we haven't talked about, which is Congress. And if we had a Congress that was doing its job, a lot of this could be stopped. So I think, and I do think if the administration pushes too hard, maybe, just maybe, we'll start to see more members of Congress. We need Republicans, though. It can't just be Democrats. And so, it's a question of how far can this administration go before they finally do something? And, I can't answer that question for them. I don't know. It hasn't happened yet, which is kind of shocking. But so there's Congress. And then, as you say, it looks like it's the Supreme Court. Now, I do think if the Supreme Court, if you had a situation where it was an American citizen that was sent to El Salvador, I like to think that is when you'd start to hear from Republican members of Congress, and they would support the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court said, you must facilitate, get this person back. This is outrageous. You can't do. I like to think that is what would happen. But, as you asked, will we get a Supreme Court that's very clear that, you cannot do this, you need to do X, Y, and Z, because that is what we're going to need to see from this court. The court tried with this order initially that says you must facilitate, and the administration has ignored that. So, it's pretty clear to me that as the case works its way up through the lower court, and it'll get appealed, I think, again, is, it's probably going to get back to the Supreme Court. And I think the next time the Supreme Court is going to need to come down more strongly. And we've seen hints of that, because we saw hints of that from another case that the court was hearing, in saying, you can't send any more, a group of people that filed a class action. They thought they were about to be removed, and they didn't have a hearing yet. And the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot remove them yet. They have to have their due process. So we're seeing some signs that the court seems like it understands the moment and that it might need to do more. I will say the cases in my book don't make me super optimistic that the court is really going to save us here, because, in each one of those cases, and there are different areas of, so there's pretrial detention for dangerousness, there's coercive plea bargaining, there's overcrowded prisons where you're jamming two people in a tiny little space that's barely big enough for one. You have a living space the size of a door, and the court knows that that's inhumane and cruel and unusual, but, they accept it. And in each of these cases, stop and frisk without probable cause, even though the Supreme Court knows the Constitution requires probable cause. There's all these cases where basically the court just gives in to what the government's asking for, because the government basically claims you have to let us do it this way because it's, public safety is at risk. And if we have to go through too many procedures, it's going to all crumble. We can't do all those things. And, that is what the administration is saying.
That's what we're hearing.
Exactly. And so I hear it and I just think, that's the argument that says you got to let us have coercive plea bargaining because we got to ram there's too many cases. Otherwise, we can't give people their constitutional jury. If everyone asked for their jury trial, the system would collapse under the weight of that constitutional guarantee. And the Supreme Court bent, if you made us have probable cause before we had to stop and frisk people, that's asking too much of the police. What if there's, they need to respond when they're suspicious? All of those cases were basically asking the Supreme Court, just cut constitutional corners a little bit because we, the government, are telling you that's what we need. Now, the one thing that is different, I think, about those cases and right now is I think every time the administration came before the court in those other contexts, I think the court assumed the administration was acting in good faith, that it was an administration that really did care about public safety, really did care about the law, and was trying to respect the law, but was balancing these other competing interests. And I think this administration has been so disrespectful to the Supreme Court, to lower courts, frankly, to lawyers, to law, to norms. And the court has to see that. And so I do think the court is starting to get the message that this isn't an administration like other administrations. And so it may be that they'll give a little less deference than they otherwise would have. And the reason that I think that is possible is because in that case where the people were being detained in Texas and they thought they were about ready to be removed and they filed this emergency order, the normal process would have been, it would first then go to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court. And, the Supreme Court wouldn't intervene at the point that it did. So it was pretty extraordinary that the court stepped in at the moment it did. And that's what led Justice Alito to write a separate dissent. He was like, this is not what we do. The order of business is usually X, Y, Z. And he wasn't wrong that it was sort of an extraordinary procedural thing that the court did. And I think the court did that because the court recognized that we can't trust this administration. They'll put those people on planes. Like, we have to say, no, you can't remove the people. We, the Supreme Court, need to step in right now and make it crystal clear. You cannot remove these people right now. They have to have a hearing. And I think it showed this court realizing that they need to be a little bit more aggressive in making clear what it is that's expected of an administration. I think they can't just assume everyone's a good faith actor that's going to, kind of do their best, because I think now what they've seen is the administration has a different attitude, which is what is the bare minimum I need to do to comply with the Supreme Court order and, still claim that I'm in compliance with it. And I think the court sees that. They see the criticism of these lower court judges. They see the threats that judges are getting because of the language that the president is using. He's saying, he's constantly claiming these judges are left-wing, woke radicals.
They should be impeached, and which is one time that the Chief Justice did speak up to say
exactly, because he knows this is really dangerous. Judges in our country get threatened. It is a real security threat, and these are not woke judges. I mean, it's an insane statement even on the merits, because these are judges. They're conservative judges. They're liberal judges. One of the Fourth Circuit judges is Judge Wilkinson, who almost never rules against the government ever. And he wrote a very poignant opinion basically saying, I really respect the executive. I defer to the executive, but this is a matter of due process. And so these are judges across the political spectrum making very clear our Constitution demands that we respect due process. I mean, I will say one other thing that gave me a little bit, it's hard to be optimistic these days, so I'm not going to lie.
Yes.
I'm not super optimistic, but the one thing I read this morning that I thought was really interesting is more than half the country thinks that the way the administration is handling the Abrego case, the Maryland man, that his case is wrong and that he should be brought back. And that's really interesting to me. So that means a majority of the country recognizes the value of due process, even for someone who is an immigrant. And, if you had asked me would I thought it would poll that way, I actually don't think I would have predicted that. I might have predicted that people would say, well, it's one thing, you come here to this country and you don't get as much, you don't get due process, or, something like the kind of thing you read in the comments of articles, the kind of statements people make. I kind of thought maybe that was the majority sentiment. But actually, I was really heartened to see that a majority of people in this country understand why due process matters for all of us. Like, you can't, if you give it away for any one person, you're giving it away for all of us. Like, it has to be something that we all stand and protect to make sure that because that is the core of our Constitution, right? That is something. It's in the Fifth Amendment, it's in the 14th Amendment. It's like, and you have to have that, because if you don't, then you don't even know who you're sending over there. You have no hearing. Right. You have no idea of what is even going on. It's the bedrock of our constitutional order.
That point that you raise of it being the core of the Constitution, which is what determines how we are governed and govern ourselves in this country. This is why it's so very important, and also why it's so deeply frightening for us, because he has demonstrated, the president has demonstrated that he will test the waters with people who don't have the full support of the country. And that's where we come in. We've had to fight with the huge support and expertise of lawyers such as yourself to have certain rights. We're dealing with several cases in the federal system, particularly Caswell, the women's medical prison, where we're dealing with the women calling and writing in and screaming out for help just for food now. And what is happening inside of what is a federal medical prison, where the women there are now being denied just basic human rights to have food, and what they are now being served, which is not food. It might be 2 pieces of bread with a piece of bologna in the middle, and that's it. And these are women who are sick. They're women who have been sent to Caswell because of their illnesses, and we're talking about cancer, and we're talking about some of the most egregious ailments that anybody anywhere could have to deal with. But to imagine having to go through that while incarcerated, and then having all of these things stripped down to the bare bones, and so we're following that as closely as we can, and we're reaching out and trying to contact. We're losing our senior legal counsel, Catherine Shevchenko, is getting kind of radio silence now, where we had over the years developed a good relationship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons and had some people in there who would respond and go check on things for us or get us some answers. We've got complete radio silence now on this. And so we're really very concerned, very, very concerned, and are trying to figure out ways. What would you suggest, as we don't want to hold you too long, and are greatly appreciative of this time that you've given us to help us better understand really where we are. But is there anything that you could suggest that an organization like ours could do to do better at trying to stay on top of this, other than just all the reading that we do every day, or all the watching the news that we do now?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think really helped flip public attention in Mr. Abrego's case, the Maryland man, was when we had a senator go down there and, try to meet with him. And so, I think just getting publicity to Carswell, maybe of getting a representative to try to go in there. Because if the administration is not responding to you, then maybe what you need to do is for the people who are housed there is contact their representatives, whoever their home district representatives are. So it gives you a broad range of people to try. So if you've got somebody and you contact as constituent services, because that's what the senator who visited down there said, is this is one of my constituents and I'm going to make sure he's okay. I think it would be really important to contact these people and say, look, these women are your constituents. Their families are your constituents. And we haven't heard anything. And they're starving and they're sick, and get someone who's willing to go there and find out what's happening and, bring some news coverage along with them, to raise the attention for people. It's hard right now to get any kind of attention for almost anything, because it's like the administration has this flood the zone strategy of, we're going to have so many challenges to the legal order and norms that it's almost hard to keep track of all of it. Because how do you get attention to this when you've also got, a tariff war, and you've got this threat of sending citizens to El Salvador, and you've got law firms and nonprofits being sued because of their viewpoint. I mean, it's crazy time to get any public attention or airspace, but I think it's important to try. And that would be my advice, is that I think my own view is I do think members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, I think they're looking for ways to try to do more, because they're just sitting there, I think they might feel a little helpless. And so I think this would be a good way to say, look, help us, to bring attention to this, because we can't get answers. Maybe they can write a letter to the BOP and get, they probably won't get a response either, because I have seen congressional letters that have been sent to this administration that have gone unanswered. But I think that would be my advice, is, to try to make it a little bit more high profile so it gets in the space, and to draw the parallel like you did, which I think is exactly right. When we think about people being locked away from society, they are still human beings. They are still people that we owe minimum constitutional requirements to. And, if you're worried about what's happening in El Salvador, you also need to be worried about what happens here in America. Right. Like, it is far too common for there to be mistreatment here as well. And I think that is a facility that is one that, kind of can highlight bigger problems in the system. But like you said, the fact that it's a medical facility and these are the most vulnerable and they're being treated this way is outrageous. Unfortunately, you can also obviously bring lawsuits. There is Eighth Amendment challenges that can be brought in situations like that. So you can file lawsuits in the district court. It's the prison conditions lawsuits are tough, as you know. Like one of the chapters is Rhodes versus Chapman, which is the one that allowed the insanely overcrowded conditions, which are horrible, and really kind of stopped the prison conditions litigation movement in its tracks. It was a really devastating case for that. But there are still wins sometimes. Those cases do sometimes still succeed. And so you can have a litigation strategy as well.
Well, we have tried it, and we did have some success during COVID, a little bit of success with bringing attention and filing a lawsuit. But we will continue our work, Professor Barkow, and look forward to seeing you still in the halls and helping us and teaching. There's nothing, as a former criminal defense attorney and as a former law student myself, the quality of professors that we were exposed to were life-changing for us. And I think that your students and the NYU is very lucky to have you teaching. And I know that we could go on for 2 days talking about what this administration is doing in regard to that. But I want to say thank you. Thank you for your voice over the years. Thank you for your courage and your understanding and your humanity. And using all of your expertise to help us in our struggles as boots on the ground, trying to create significant change in our criminal law system. So I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you for your time. And please listen out in case we have to call you back if things
Oh, no,
ramp
my
up
pleasure.
some.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you do. Really, the things all goes in your direction. I admire so much all the things you fight for. So yeah, it was an honor to be here today. Thank you.